Betty's battlecruisers loomed out of the mist at 12:37. By this time, New Zealand had fallen behind the three newer and faster battlecruisers and was not in position to significantly participate in the battle. Strasbourg was able to evade fire by hiding in the mist, but Holland remained visible and was quickly crippled by the British squadrons before the German ship could be sunk. Betty was distracted by sudden appearance of the elderly light cruiser HMS Adrian off his starboard bow. He turned to pursue, but Adrian was set afire after only 3 salvos fired from under 6,000 yards. At 13:10, Betty turned north and began a general signal to retire. Shortly after turning north, the battlecruisers encountered the crippled Colon and immediately began firing at the crippled cruiser. But with only 2 salvos from the Lion, the cruiser would be sunk. Before we get into the long history of the HMS New Zealand, I would like to give a word to our sponsor of today's video, W Energy. W is an energy drink making company that reached out to me in order to do a sponsorship. I've been using W for a long time now, and I cannot stress to you enough how amazing they are. You don't just have to use them for working out. You can use them for everyday hydration. I use them when I'm doing long recording sessions when making these videos, at work, and when I'm working out. They are probably the cheapest you'll find for a solid energy drink company. And if you use the code anchored/1914 at the link in the description, you'll get a 10% discount on your entire order. I promise it is well worth it. Now, with that out of the way, get ready to sail into the past as we cover the history of the battlecruiser HMS New Zealand from the start of her designing to her final days. At the start of the 20th century, the British Admiralty maintained that the naval defense of the British Empire, including the Dominions, should be unified underneath the Royal Navy. Attitudes on this matter softened during the first decade, and at the 1909 Imperial Conference, the Admiralty proposed the creation of fleet units. Forces consisting of a battlecruiser, 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 3 submarines, while Australia and Canada were encouraged to purchase fleet units to serve as the core of the new national navies. Other fleet units should be operated by the Royal Navy at distant bases, particularly in the Far East. New Zealand was asked to partially subside a fleet unit for the China station. To this end, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Sir Joseph Ward, announced on the 22nd of March 1909 that his country would fund a battleship, later changed to the Indefatigable-class battlecruiser, as an example to other countries. It is unclear why this design was selected, given that it was known to be inferior to the battlecruisers entering service with the Imperial German Navy, or also known as the German Kaiserliche Marine. Historian John Roberts has suggested that the request may have been attributable to the Royal Navy's practices of using smaller battleships and large cruisers as flagships of stations far from the United Kingdom, or it might have reflected the preferences of the First Sea Lord, Admiral of the Fleet, John Fisher, preferences not widely shared. The New Zealand government, took out a loan to fund the cost of the warship. When it came to naming the new ship, the most obvious name was already being used by the existing King Edward VII class battleship HMS New Zealand. It was decided to transfer the name to the newer battlecruiser and to rename the older ship. Among the suggested names were Ara, Caledonia, Wellington, and Māori, which was already being used by a destroyer, and thus would have to require a double renaming. Being floated before Zealandia was eventually decided upon and subsequently approved by the king. Wright has identified that the controller of the Admiralty, John Jellicoe, had wanted to have Australia and New Zealand constructed by the same shipbuilder. This would have reduced construction costs and simplified administration. Tenders were issued early in 1910, but of those who were prepared to tender, all were only prepared to construct one vessel. Both Australia and New Zealand, for unknown reasons, agreed to accept that of John Brown and Company, which was highest of the two successful tenders. But the former signaled its acceptance first, leaving New Zealand to accept that of Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering. The estimated cost of Fairfield's offer was €1.8 million, which included the guns and the first issue and ammunition. Fairfield had already built the HMS Indomitable, which would have given them confidence in their cost estimate, which included all stores, including first coal and ammunition. In the end, John Brown and Company delivered Australia well under their original tender price. New Zealand's keel was laid at Fairfield's yard on the Clyde on the 20th of June, 1910. The construction contract was between the Admiralty and Fairfield, using the Admiralty's standard contract terms, and was overseen by the Admiralty, with manufacturers' payment claims being approved and then passed on by the Admiralty to the New Zealand High Commission's office in London for forwarding on to New Zealand for payment. Variation claims were often individually itemized and passed on for payment, with some payments still being processed as late as 1914 through 1915 in that financial year. The ship was built with all stores supplied for the Admiralty at the rate book price, plus 20%. With exception of the coal, the Admiralty did not charge New Zealand for its management of the project. Fairchild's share of the contract made a profit of €50,454, or 6%. The four main gun mountings were made by Armstrong Whitworth's Elswick Ordnance Works at a cost of €207,593, excluding delivery and assembly. While the guns were supplied by both Armstrong Whitworth and Vickers, the 22 12-inch guns, which included 6 spares, and 36 4-inch guns, which included 4 spares, required to equip both of the Dominion ships, cost a combined total of €249,550. New Zealand was launched on the 1st of July 1911, in front of 8,000 onlookers by Lady Thurso Ward, the wife of Sir Joseph Ward, using a bottle of New Zealand wine for the christening. Following her launch, the New Zealand is moved by the Clyde Shipping Company's tugs, Flying Linnet and Flying Swallow, by the shipyard's fitting out basin, for installation of the boilers, engines, and auxiliary machines through temporary openings in the main deck before the superstructure and armament were installed. The battlecruiser's first captain, 40-year-old Leon Halsey, took command on the 21st of September 1912. Sea trials began in October, with the hull checking in dry dock on the 8th of October prior to a 30-hour steam test at 3/4 power being undertaken on the 9th and 10th of October. Full power tests were conducted off Piupiu on the 14th of October, with 49,080 and 48 horsepower being generated. These tests found that she met her design speed with an average speed of over an 8-hour period of 25.1 knots and 26.1 knots. While experiencing near ideal sea conditions, with the machinery generating 49,048 horsepower at an average speed of 297.687 revolutions. Over the measured mile, she reached a top speed of 25.4 knots based on revolutions and 26.3 knots by bearings. Following gun and torpedo trials in mid-October, the battlecruiser returned to Fairfield to correct any defects and make modifications before acceptance inspections commenced in mid-November. The New Zealand was officially commissioned at Govan on the 19th of November 1912. The Admiralty required that all new ships be dry docked as part of the acceptance process to allow the completion and inspection of all underwater fittings. As Fairchild didn't have their own dry dock, the ship sailed from Govan with the nucleus of her crew to Devonport to use the shipyard's facilities. By now, the ship's hull had spent a considerable time in Fairchild's often polluted fitting-out basing, so the hull was cleaned and then painted with a fresh anti-fouling coating. The ship was officially completed on the 23rd of November 1912, when she reached her normally full completion of crew. Her officers by now included 3 New Zealanders: Lieutenant Alexander David Boyle, 1887 through 1965, Lieutenant Rupert Clare Garcia, and Midshipman Hugh Beacon Anderson, 1897 through 1971, all from Christchurch. To signal her upcoming completion, the New Zealand government commissioned the marine artist William Leon Wilhey to produce a painting of the New Zealand, which he titled The Tower House, Portsmouth, HMS New Zealand, Fitting Out. In subsequent years, he also produced other paintings of the ship. The Indefatigable-class was not a significant improvement on the preceding Invincible-class. The main difference was the enlargement of the dimensions to give the ship's 2 wing turrets a wider arc of fire. The ships were smaller and not as well protected as the contemporary German battlecruiser HMS von der Tann and subsequent other German designs. While von der Tann's characteristics were not known when the lead ship of the class, Indefatigable, was laid down in February 1909, the Royal Navy obtained accurate information on the German ship before beginning work on the New Zealand and her sister ship, HMAS Australia. New Zealand had an overall length of 590 feet, a beam of 80 feet, and a draught of 29 feet 9 inches. At deep load, the ship displaced 18,501 tons at load and 22,130 long tons at deep load. She initially had a crew of 818 officers in rating, though this was to increase in subsequent years. At the time of her visit in New Zealand, in 1913, the engineering department had a staff of 335. The ship was powered by 2 sets of Parison direct-drive steam turbines, each driving 2 propeller shafts, using steam provided by 31 coal-burning Babcock and Wilcox boilers. The turbines were rated at 44,000 shaft horsepower and were intended to give the ship a maximum speed of 25 knots. However, during sea trials in 1912, the turbines produced over 49,000 ship horsepower, which allowed New Zealand to reach a max speed of 26.39 knots. The ship carried enough coal and fuel oil to give her a range of 6,690 nautical miles at a speed of 10 knots. The ship carried 8 B&L 12-inch Mark 10 guns and 4 twin-gun turrets. 2 turrets were mounted fore and aft on the centerline, identified as A and X respectively. The other 2 were wing turrets, mounted amidships and staggered diagonally. P was forward and to port of the center funnel, while Q turret was situated starboard and aft. Each wing turret had a limited ability to fire to the opposite side, but if the ship was full broadside to her target, she could bring all 8 main battery guns to bear. Her secondary armament consisted of 16 4-inch B&L Mark 7 guns positioned on the superstructure. She mounted 2 18-inch submerged torpedo tubes, one on each side of the X turret barbette, and 12 torpedoes were carried. The Indefatigable-class were protected by a waterline armor of 4 to 6 inches in thickness. The armor belt was extended between and covered the end barbettes. Their armored deck ranged in thickness between 1.5 and 2.5 inches thick, with the thickest portion protecting the steering gear and the stern. The turret face were 7 inches thick, and the turrets were supported by a barbette of the same thickness. New Zealand's 8 turret was fitted with a 9-foot, 2.7-meter rangefinder at the rear of the turret roof. It was also equipped to control the entire main armament of the event, that the normal fire control positions were knocked out or communication between the primary positions and the gun layers were disabled. The ship was fitted with a single Q&F 6-pounder Hawkes anti-aircraft gun from October 1914 to the end of 1915. In March of 1915, a single Q&F 3-inch 20 CWT AA gun was added. It was provided with 500 rounds. The battlecruisers' 4-inch guns were enclosed in casemates and given blast shields during a refit in November to better protect the gun crews from weather and enemy action. 2 aft guns were removed at this time. New Zealand received a fire control director sometime between mid-1915 and May 1916. This centralized fire control under the direct officer, who now fired the guns. The turret crewmen merely had to follow pointer transmissions from the director to align their guns on the target. This greatly increased accuracy as it was easier to spot the fall of shells and eliminate the problem of the ship's roll dispersing the shells when each turret fired independently. To address the deficiencies in the armor of the British capital ships raised by the Battle of Jutland, New Zealand entered the dockyard in November 1916, where an additional inch of armor was added to select horizontal areas of the deck. In the forward part of the ship, it was covering the magazine for a turret and 4-inch guns. Midships to cover the magazine for Q and P turrets, while it was extended vertically by 3 to 6 inches, or 3 feet 6 inches, to protect the magazine trunks and escape shafts. During a refit in June 1917, the armor was again improved when 1-inch armor plating was added on the lower deck at the bottom of the inner and outer upper coal bunkers, as well as over the boilers. By 1918, New Zealand carried 2 aircraft, a soup with pup and a soup with 1.5 strutter, on flying-off ramps fitted on top of P and Q turrets. The pup was intended to shoot down zeppelins, while the 1.5 strutter was used for spotting and reconnaissance. Each platform had a canvas hangar to protect the aircraft during inclement weather. In preparation for its role as Admiral Jellicoe's personal transport, for his planned visit to Australia, Canada, India, and New Zealand. New Zealand was refitted between December 1918 and February 1919. The four topmasts and both top gallants were replaced. Our flying off platforms were removed, and new peacetime trim was installed. The range clocks were removed, and the deflection scales on the turrets were painted over. The lower forward 4-inch guns were removed and replaced with cabins on the port and starboard sides. The forward superstructure to house Jellicoe and provide offices for a staff of 8. While in Bombay in 1919, the battlecruiser was painted in a light gray color. In December 1912, the battlecruiser began the task of working up prior to joining the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron. While at sea over the 1912 through 1913 New Year, some of the massing was damaged by a storm. In 1912, it was agreed that the ship would visit its donor country as a thank you for funding its construction. With basic 9-month-long itinerary development period in the last months of 1912. To facilitate the flag-waving cruise, New Zealand was temporarily detached from the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron on the 20th of January 1913 for the duration of the voyage, with Halsey having independent command. The initial date of departure progressively moved backward into 1913, with the ship finally departing the Royal Navy dockyard at Devonport on the 28th of January for Portsmouth, which it reached 2 days later. On the 3rd of February, 300 expert New Zealanders, organized by Sir Thomas Mackenzie, New Zealand's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, visited the ship, at which he unveiled the battlecruiser's coat of arms, which had been gifted by the country's expert community in the United Kingdom. This was followed by a visit by King George V, accompanied by Winston Churchill and James Allen, New Zealand's Minister of Finance and Defence, and other high-ranking officials on the 5th of February 1913. As soon as the King's party had departed New Zealand took on coal before departing Portsmouth on the 6th of February. There were stops at St. Vincent, Anson Island, Cape Town, Simonestown, and Durban in South Africa, and then at Melbourne in Australia before New Zealand reached Wellington, New Zealand, on the 12th of April. This was the first set of events that grouped the country, as thousands of New Zealanders came to catch a sight of and would possibly visit our dreadnought. For the ship's crew, this meant having to attend a constant parade of events and festivities. After an 11-day stay in the capital of New Zealand proceeded up the east coast of the North Island to visit Napier, Gisborne, and Auckland, before steaming south to visit Withund, Akara, where she exercised with HMS New before continuing on to Timaru, Onken Harbor, Bluff, Milford Sound, Greymouth, Westport, Nelson, and Prince, before stopping again in Wellington. From there, she proceeded up the west coast of the North Island, visiting Wellington, Roseau, and back to Auckland, which was reached on the 21st of June. The battlecruiser received numerous gifts while in New Zealand, including a naval ensign and a Union Jack. 2 pendants, which were intended to ward off evil, were gifted to the ship. One was given by the Boy Scouts of Wellington on the 13th of April, and the second by Christian Church businessman C.J. Solomon in May of 1913. He had deposited the pendant at a Canterbury museum in 1913, and then uplifted it in a few months later in order to lend it to the ship on the condition that it had to be returned to Canterbury Museum should the name New Zealand ever be removed from the Navy list. The most notable gift was a personal gift to Halsey of a warrior skirt made from rolled flax. By the end of the voyage, New Zealand had sailed some 45,320 miles, consumed 31,833 tons of coal, and had been visited by 500,151 people, in what was the longest voyage to date by a vessel of the Dreadnought era. The voyage judged such a success that Halsey was knighted for his efforts. The Admiralty requested that the New Zealand return to the United Kingdom when the tour concluded, rather than remain in the Pacific region as originally planned. The New Zealand government acceded to the request. As a result, upon her return to the United Kingdom, the New Zealand joined the first battlecruiser squadron of the Grand Fleet. The squadron visited Brest in February 1914, and Riggs, Revel, and Kronstadt in the Russian Empire the following June. While they were visiting by the Tassar and Tassadera on the 27th of June, and that evening hosted in a formal ball in conjunction with the Lion, which was mourned alongside the New Zealand. On the 29th of June, the squadron departed for the United Kingdom. The intention was that the New Zealand would decommission on the 30th of August prior to transferring to the Mediterranean Fleet, where she would become the flagship of Rear Admiral Archibald Moore, but the outbreak of war cancelled that deployment. On the 19th of August 1914, shortly after the First World War began, the New Zealand was transferred to the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron. New Zealand's first wartime action was at the Battle of the Heligoland Bight on the 28th of August 1914, as part of the battlecruiser force under the command of Admiral David Beatty. Beatty's ships were originally intended to provide distant support for the British cruisers and destroyers closer to the German coast, in case large units of the High Seas Fleet sortied in response to the British attack once the tide rose. When the British light forces failed to disengage on schedule at 11:35, the battlecruisers, led by Beatty aboard his flagship the Lion, began to head south at full speed to reinforce the smaller British ships. The rising tide meant that the German capital ships would be able to clear the sandbar at the mouth of the Jade estuary. The brand new light cruiser Athirsa had been crippled earlier in the battle and was under heavy fire from the German light cruiser SMS Strasbourg and SMS Colon. When Beatty's battlecruisers loomed out of the mist at 12:37, by this time, New Zealand had fallen behind the three newer and faster battlecruisers, and was not in position to significantly participate in the battle. Strasbourg was able to evade fire by hiding in the mists, but Colon remained visible and was quickly crippled by the British squadron. Before the German ship could be sunk, Beatty was distracted by the sudden appearance of the elderly light cruiser SMS Argentine off his starboard bow. He turned to pursue, but Argentine was set afire after only 3 salvos was set fire from under 6,000 yards. At 13:10, Beatty turned north and made a general signal to retire. Shortly after returning north, the battlecruisers encountered the crippled Colon, which was sunk by 2 salvos from the Lion. During the battle, New Zealand's captain, Leonard Halsey, wore the Māori piupiu over his uniform, setting a tradition followed for the duration of the war. 2 days after the battle, New Zealand was transferred back to the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron when the battlecruiser Inflexible arrived from the Mediterranean. The German Navy had decided on a strategy of bombarding British towns on the North Sea coast in an attempt to draw out the Royal Navy and destroy elements of it in great detail. An earlier raid on Yarmouth on the 3rd of November 1914 had been partially successful, but a larger-scale operation was later devised by Admiral Franz von Hipper. The fast battlecruisers would conduct the bombardment, while the rest of the High Seas Fleet stationed southeast of Dodger Bank, so they could cover the battlecruisers' return and destroy any pursuing British vessels. Having broke the German naval codes, the British were planning on catching the raiding force on its return journey, although they were not aware of the High Seas Fleet's presence. Admiral Beatty's 1st Battlecruiser Squadron now reduced to 4 ships, including the New Zealand, and the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, consisting of 6 dreadnoughts, were detached from the Grand Fleet in an attempt to intercept the Germans near Dodger Bank. Admiral Hipper's raiders set sail on the 15th of December 1914 and successfully bombarded several English towns. The British destroyers escorting the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron had already encountered German destroyers of the High Seas Fleet, and at 05:15 and fought in inconclusive action with them. Vice Admiral Sir George Warden, commanding the 2nd Battle Squadron, had received a signal at 05:40 that destroyer Lynx was engaging enemy destroyers, although Beatty had not. The destroyer Shark spotted the German armored cruiser SMS Rune and her escorts at around 0700 hours, but could not transmit the message until 0725. Admiral Warrender received the signal, as did New Zealand, but Beatty, aboard land, did not, even though New Zealand had been significantly, or specifically, tasked to relay messages between the destroyers and the flagship. Warrender attempted to pass on Shark's message to Beatty at 0736, but did not manage to make contact until 0755. On receiving the message, Beatty reversed course and dispatched New Zealand to search for room. She was being overwhelmed by New Zealand when Beatty received messages that Scarborough was being shelled at 0900 hours. Beatty ordered New Zealand to rejoin the squadron and turned west for Scarborough. The British forces, heading west to cover the main route through the minefields protecting the coast of England, split up while passing the shallow southwest patch of Dodger Bank. Beatty's ship headed to the north, while Warrender passed to the south. This left a 15 nautical mile gap between them, through which German light forces began to move. At 12:25, the light cruisers of the 2nd Scouting Group began to pass the British forces searching for Hipper. The light cruiser Southampton spotted the light cruiser SMS Stralsund and signaled to report to Beatty. At 13:20, Beatty turned his battlecruisers towards the German ships, which he presumed were the advancing stern of Hipper's ships. However, those were some 50 kilometers behind. The 2nd Light Cruiser Squadron, which had been screening for Beatty's ships, detached to pursue the German cruisers, but a misinterpreted signal from the British battlecruisers sent them back to their screening positions. This confusion allowed the German light cruisers to escape, and alerted Hipper to the location of the British battlecruisers. The German battlecruisers go to the northeast of the British forces and also make good their escape. The New Zealand would become flagship of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron of the Grand Fleet on the 15th of January 1915, and would see action the following week in the Battle of the Dodger Bank. On the 23rd of January 1915, a force of German battlecruisers under the command of Admiral Hipper sorted to clear the Dodger Bank of any British fishing boats or smaller craft that might be there to collect intelligence on German movements. alerted by decoded German transmissions. A larger force of British battlecruisers, including the New Zealand, sailed under the command of Admiral David Beatty to intercept. Contact was initiated at 0720 on the 21st of January, when Arthurus spotted the German light cruiser HMS Königsberg. By 0735, the Germans had spotted Beatty's force, and Hipper ordered a turn south at 20 knots. Believing that this speed would outdistance any British battlecruisers to the northwest, he planned to increase speed to the armored cruiser SMS Bluka's maximum speed of 23 knots, if necessary to outrun any battlecruisers. Beatty ordered his battleships to make all practical speed to catch the Germans before they could escape. New Zealand and Indomitable were the slowest of Beatty's ships, and gradually fell behind the newer battlecruisers. Despite New Zealand achieving an incredible speed of 27 knots due to the original over-design of the engines and to the effort of her stokers. Despite dropping behind, New Zealand was able to open fire on Bluka by 0935 and continued to engage the armored cruiser after the other British battlecruisers switched targets to the German battlecruisers. After about an hour, the New Zealand had knocked out Bluka's forward turret, and Indomitable began to fire on her as well. At 10:30, two 12-inch shells pierced the German ship's armored deck and exploded in an ammunition room 4 minutes later. This started a fire amidships that destroyed her two-port 21-centimeter 8.3-inch turrets, while the concussion damaged her engine so that her speed dropped to 17 knots and jammed her steering gears. At 10:48, Beatty ordered Indomitable to attack her, but the combination of a signal error by Beatty's ship lieutenant and heavy damage to Beatty's flagship Lion, which had knocked out her radio and caused enough smoke to obscure her signal halyards, caused the rest of the British battlecruisers temporarily under the command of Rear Admiral Sir Gordon Moore in New Zealand to think that the signal applied to them. In response, they turned away from Hipper's main body and engaged Bluka. New Zealand fired a total of 140 shells at Bluka before the German ships capsized and sank at 12:07 after being torpedoed by the Arthurus. Halsey had again wore the piupiu over his uniform during the battle, and the lack of damage to New Zealand was once more attributed to its good luck properties. New Zealand was relieved by Australia as flagship of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron on the 22nd of February 1915. The squadron joined the Grand Fleet in Astorti on the 29th of March, in response to intelligence that the German fleet was leaving port as the Perskir to a major operation. By the next night, the German ships had withdrawn, and the squadron returned to Rosyth. On the 11th of April, the British fleet was again deployed on the intelligence that a German force was planning an operation. The Germans intended to lay mines at the Swarty Bank, but after encountering a Zeppelin located a British light cruiser squadron, they began to prepare for what they thought was a British attack. Heavy fog and the need to refuel caused Australia and the British vessels to return to port on the 17th of April, and although they were redeployed that night, they were unable to stop two German light cruisers from laying the minefield. In June of 1915, Halsey was promoted to captain of the fleet, with rank of Commodore, on the HMS Iron Duke, and was succeeded by Captain of New Zealand by J.F.E. Jimmy Green. Despite it being his personal property, Halsey left the piupiu in the care of Green. From the 26th to the 28th of January 1916, The 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron was positioned off the Scarborough, while the 1st Light Cruiser Squadron swept the strait in an unsuccessful search for a possible minor error. On the morning of the 21st of April 1916, the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron left Rosyth at 0400 hours, accompanied by the 4th Light Cruiser Squadron and destroyers, again bound for the Scarborough, this time to support efforts to disrupt the transport of Swedish ore to Germany. The planned destroyer sweep of the Kattegat was cancelled when word came that the High Seas Fleet was mobilizing for an operation of their own, later learned to be timed to coincide with the Irish Eastern Rising, and the British ships were ordered to rendezvous point in the middle of the North Sea with the 1st and 3rd Battlecruiser Squadrons, while the rest of the Grand Fleet made for the southeast end of Long Forties. At 15:30 in the afternoon of the 22nd of April, the 3 squadrons of battlecruisers were patrolling together to the northwest of Horn's Reef when heavy fog came down, while the ships were steaming abreast at 19.5 knots, with Australia on the port flank. Concerned about possible submarine attack, Beatty issued instructions at 15:35 for the fleet to commence zigzagging. It took some time for the instructions to be relayed by signal fog down the line, and so it wasn't until 15:40 that Australia, with a cruiser to her port side, commenced her first zigzagging and swung to starboard. The crew were aware that New Zealand was on that side about 5 cables, or 926 meters away, but the poor visibility meant that they made their turn. They didn't see her until it was too late, and they hit at 15:43, despite Australia attempting to turn away to port. Australia's side was torn open from frames 59 to 78, but the armor plate on the hull below her sister's P turret, while as New Zealand turned away, her outer port propeller damaged Australia's hull below her Q turret. Australia slowed to half speed as the mist hit her sister ship, but the damage to the New Zealand's propeller caused a temporary loss of control, and she swung back in front of Australia, which, despite turning to port, had her stern crushed at 15:46 as she skirted the side of New Zealand, just behind her P turret. Both ships came to a complete stop about 30 to 40 yards apart, while their respective officers assigned the damage. The damage control teams of the Australia were soon busy storing up bulkheads and sealing off the damaged portions to prevent any more water entering the ship. Meanwhile, off watch, Australia's sailors took advantage of a convenient potato locker to hurl both its contents and insults at the crew of their nearby sister ship. New Zealand was soon underway, returning to Rosyth with the rest of the squadron. The same fog caused the battleship Neptune to collide with a merchant ship and the destroyers Pendant, Aviant, and Garland to collide with one another. Once it was safe to proceed, Australia, with her speeder restricted to 12 knots, and then later to 16 knots, arrived back at Rosyth to find both dry docks occupied, one by HMS New Zealand and the other by HMS Dreadnought, so she departed for Newcastle on Tyne, where she was further damaged trying to dock during strong winds. As this facility couldn't handle all the repairs that it needed, the battlecruiser was ordered to Devonport. Australia was not able to return to sea until the 31st of May, thus missing the Battle of Jutland. Meanwhile, New Zealand replaced her damaged propeller with Australia's spare propeller which was in store at Rosyth, and returned to the fleet on the 30th of May, a day before the start of the Battle of Jutland. Due to the continued absence of Australia, Rear Admiral William Christopher Parkenham transferred his flag from the Indefatigable to the New Zealand. On the 31st of May 1916, the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron consisted of its flagship New Zealand and the Indefatigable. Australia was still under repairs following her collision with the New Zealand. The squadron was assigned to Admiral David Beattie's battlecruiser squadron, which had been put to sea to intercept a sortie by the High Seas Fleet into the North Sea. The British were able to decode the messages by the Germans, and left their bases before the Germans could put to sea. Hipper's battlecruiser spotted the battlecruiser fleet to their west at 1520, but Beattie's ships did not spot the Germans to their east until 1530. 2 minutes later, he ordered a course change to east-southeast to position himself astride the Germans' line of retreat, and called his ship's crews to action stations. He also ordered the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, which had been leading, to fall in astern of the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron. Hipper ordered his ships to turn to starboard, away from the British, to assume a southeasterly course, and reduced speed to 18 knots, to allow through-light cruisers of the 2nd Scouting Group to catch up. With this turn, Hipper was falling back on the High Seas Fleet, then about 60 miles behind him. Around this time, Beattie altered course to the east, as it quickly became apparent that he was still too far north to cut off Hipper. Thus began the so-called run to the south, as Beattie changed course to steer east-southeast at 1545, paralleling Hipper's course. Now that the range close to under 1,800 or 18,000 yards, the Germans opened fire first at 1548, followed by the British. The British ships were still in the process of making their turn, and only the 2 leading ships, Lion and Princess Royal, had steadied on their course when the Germans opened fire. The British information was Heligoland to the right, with Indefatigable in the rear, and the furthest to the east, or to the west, and New Zealand ahead of her and slightly turned further east. The German fire was accurate from the beginning, but the British overestimated the range as the German ships blended into the haze. Indefatigable aimed at Wartime, while New Zealand disengaged herself, targeting HMS New Zealand. By 1554, the range was down to 12,900 yards, and Beattie ordered a course change 2 points to starboard to open up the range at 1554 or 1557. Indefatigable was destroyed at about 1603 when her magazines exploded. After the loss of Indefatigable, New Zealand shifted her fire to Wartime, in accordance with Beattie's standing instructions. The range had grown too far for accurate shooting, so Beattie altered course at 4 points to the port to close the range again between 1612 and 1615. By this time, the 5th Battle Squadron, consisting of the 4 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, had closed up and was engaging Wartime and Moltke. At 1623, a 13.5-inch, 340mm shell from Tiger struck near Wartime's rear turret, starting a fire among the practice targets stowed there, and completely obscured the ship, and caused New Zealand to shift fire to Moltke. At 1626, the ship was hit by a 28cm, 11-inch shell, fired by Wartime on Scarborough that detonated on contact and knocked loose a piece of armor that briefly jammed X turret and blew a hole in the upper deck. 4 minutes later, Southampton, scouting in front of the Betty ships, spotted the lead elements of the high seas fleet trudging north at top speed. 3 minutes later, she sighted the topmasts of Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer's battleships, but did not transmit a message to Beatty for another 5 minutes. Beatty continued south for another 2 minutes to confirm the sighting himself, before ordering a 16-point turn to starboard in succession. New Zealand, the last ship in the line, turned prematurely to stay out of range of the oncoming battleships. New Zealand was straddled several times by the battleship HMS Leopold, but was not hit. Beatty ships maintained full speed in an attempt to increase the distance between them and the high seas fleet, and gradually moved out of range. They turned north and then northeast to try to rendezvous with the main body of the Grand Fleet, under the command of John Jellicoe. At 1740, they opened fire on the German battlecruisers. The setting sun blinded the German gunners, and as they could not make out the British ships, they turned away at a northeastern turn at 5:47. Beatty gradually turned more towards the east to allow him to cover the deployment of the Grand Fleet in battle formation and to move ahead of it. But he mistimed his maneuver and forced the leading division to fall off towards the east, further away from the Germans. By 1835, Beatty was following Indomitable and Inflexible of the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron as they were steering east-southeast, leading the Grand Fleet, and continued to engage Hipper's battlecruisers to the southwest. A few minutes earlier, Scheer had ordered a simultaneous 180 degrees starboard turn, and Beatty lost sight of the high seas fleet in the haze. 20 minutes later, Scheer ordered another 180-degree turn, which put them in a covering or converging course again with the British, which had altered course to the south. This allowed the Grand Fleet to cross Scheer's T, form a battle line that cut across his battle line and badly damaged his leading ships. Scheer ordered yet another 180-degree turn at 1913 in an attempt to extradite the high seas fleet from the trap in which he had set them. This was successful, and the British lost sight of the Germans until 8:05, when Castor spotted smoke bearing west-northwest. 10 minutes later, she had closed the range enough to identify German torpedo boats and engaged them. Beatty turned west upon hearing gunfire and spotted the German battlecruisers only 8,500 yards away. Inflexible opened fire at 2020, followed by the rest of Beatty's battlecruisers. New Zealand and Indomitable concentrated their fire on SMS satellites and hit her 5 times before she turned west to disengage. Shortly after 2030, the pre-dreadnought battleships of Rear Admiral Molo's 2nd Battle Squadron were spotted and fire switched to them. The Germans had poor visibility and were able to fire only a few rounds at them before turning away to the west. The British battlecruisers hit the German ships several times before they blended into the haze around 8:40. After this, Beatty changed course to the southeast, and maintained that course, ahead of both the Grand Fleet and the High Seas Fleet, until 02:55 the next morning, when the order was given to reverse course and head home. New Zealand arrived back in Rosyth on the 2nd of June and dropped anchor at 09:55. The crew had approximately 50 minutes to rest before, with the potential possibility that she may have to put to sea again. They began the task of refueling with 1,178 tons of coal, and then replenishing the ammunition with 480 12-inch shells, work which continued until 03:30 in the following morning. New Zealand fired 430 12-inch shells during the battle, 100 from A turret, 129 from P turret, 105 from Q turret, and 96 from X turret, more than any other ship on either side. Despite this rate of fire, only 4 successful hits were credited to her, 3 on Cedits, and 1 on the pre-dreadnought HMS Schleswig-Holstein. This gave a hit rate of less than 1%. Other than the single hit on X turret, the only other damage was from the near misses and was minimal, consisting of a shell through the silk jack, a splinter hitting the ensign staff. The number 3 cutter hit had some damage to its bow, and the number 2 picket turret was hit in 3 places. This confirmed to the crew that the piupiu and hei-tiki worn by Captain Green brought good luck to the ship. Grant Howard would write in his book, The Navy in New Zealand, the ship's company were firm believers both in the old chief's prophecy and in the ability of the piupiu and tiki to ward off trouble, that more than a year after the Battle of Jutland, on the last occasion that New Zealand sighted enemy ships and went to action stations, a seaman was seen to climb a ladder to the bridge and take a look around. "It's all right," he called to his mates below. "He's got them on." A shout that assured them that the captain was wearing the piupiu and the tiki. New Zealand was relieved by Australia as flagship on the 9th of June, and temporarily attached to the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron, until the HMS Renown relieved her in September. On the evening of the 18th of August, the Grand Fleet put to sea in response to a message deciphered by Room 40 that indicated the High Seas Fleet, minus the 2nd Squadron, would be leaving the harbor that night. The German objective was to bombard Sunderland on the 19th of August, based on extensive reconnaissance provided by airships and submarines. The Grand Fleet sailed with 29 dreadnought battleships and 6 battlecruisers. Throughout the next day, Jellicoe and Scheer received conflicted intelligence. After reaching the location in the North Sea, where the British expected to encounter the High Seas Fleet, they turned north in the erroneous belief that they had entered a minefield. Scheer turned south again, then steered southeastward to pursue a lone British battle squadron sighted by an airship, which was in fact the Hartwich force of cruisers and destroyers under Commodore Trywhitt. Realizing their mistake, the Germans changed course for home. The only contact came in the evening, when Trywhitt sighted the High Seas Fleet, but was unable to achieve an adventurous attack position before dark, and broke off contact. The British and German fleets returned home. The British had lost 2 cruisers to submarine attacks, and 1 German dreadnought had been torpedoed. New Zealand underwent a refit in Rosyth on November of 1916. She temporarily replaced Australia's squadron flagship between the 29th of November and the 7th of January 1917. On the 1st of October 1917, Green, following a promotion to Rear Admiral, gave up his command of the ship. But it wasn't until the 13th of December 1917 that Captain Edward Kennedy took on temporary command, which he held until the 17th of January 1918, when Richard Webb took over the permanent captain. Webb remained captain until September of 1918, when he was made a rear admiral, and left to take up the role of Assistant High Commissioner at Constantinople. In the later stages of the war, a number of New Zealand soldiers on leave were able to take advantage of the open invitation to extend it to them by the New Zealand's captain to visit the ship. German minesweepers and escorting light cruisers were attempted to clear British-laid minefields in the Heligoland Bight in late 1917. The Admiralty planned a large operation for the 17th of November to destroy the ships and locate two light cruiser squadrons and the first cruiser squadron, covered by the reinforced first battlecruiser squadron and more distantly the first battle squadron with battleships. New Zealand was attached to the first battlecruiser squadron for this operation, which became known as the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight. New Zealand did not fire her guns during the battle. As in previous engagements, Captain Green wore the piupiu and hei-tiki for luck. During 1918, New Zealand and the Grand Fleet's other capital ships were used on occasion to escort convoys between the United Kingdom and Norway. The second battlecruiser squadron spent the period from the 8th to the 21st of February covering these convoys in company with battleships and destroyers, and put to sea on the 6th of March in company with the 1st Battlecruiser Squadron to support mine layers. The 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron again supported mine layers in the North Sea from the 25th of June or the 26th of June to the end of July. During September and October, New Zealand and the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron supervised and protected mine laying operations north of Orkney. By the time of the 1918 armistice, New Zealand had, since August 1914, sailed 84,458 nautical miles, consumed 97,000 tons of coal, and fired a total of 664 12-inch shells in action. As a member of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, the battlecruiser was present at the surrender of the High Seas Fleet in November of 1918. To witness the event, New Zealand embarked 5 soldiers from the New Zealand Division and a New Zealand newspaper reporter. New Zealand was assigned responsibility for checking the compliance of HMS Darthlinger with the terms of its interment. In September of 1818, Leonard Andrew Boyd Dawson took over command of the ship and remained in command until the 11th of February 1919. With the war at an end, most of the United Kingdom's older capital ships were put into reserve, as they were by now obsolete, and with the government wishing to make significance in its military expenditure, there was little chance of their returning to full service, especially once the formal peace treaty was signed with Germany in mid-1919. One exception was the New Zealand, which it was decided would be used to transport Admiral Jellicoe on what was to be an expected year-long visit to India and the dominions of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand to assist with planning and coordinating their naval policies and defenses. To prepare her for the voyage, the battlecruiser underwent a refit between December of 1918 and the 11th of February 1919, at the end of which she was recommissioned with a virtually all-new crew under the command of Captain Oliver Ellis Leggett. Among the crew were 4 New Zealanders: Alexander David Boyle, who was by now a lieutenant commander, Surgeon Lieutenant George Donald McConst, Sub-Lieutenant Marion S. Thomas, and Midshipman Dirk Perry. Lady Jellicoe accompanied her husband, as well as a staff of 8, to assist him with his work. Also on the ship was Cutha Mackenzie, the blind son of the New Zealand High Commissioner, who was returning to New Zealand as Jellicoe's guest. The battlecruiser would depart Portsmouth on the 31st of February 1919, and not return back to Portsmouth until the 3rd of February 1920, having covered some 33,514 nautical miles. As Jellicoe had been promoted to Admiral of the Fleet while overseas, the ship was greeted by the appropriate 19-gun salute from the HMS Victory. On the 6th of February, the HMS New Zealand was pulled by tugs till morning on the HMS. Most of the crew was sent on a 6 weeks leave, with the skeleton crew of about 250 remaining behind under the command of Lieutenant Commander Alexander David Boyle. Legit gave a command in New Zealand and was succeeded by Captain Hartle Russell Guadanop Moore on the 11th of March 1920. Moore remained in that position until July of 1921. New Zealand was eventually paid off into reserve on the 15th of March 1920, but this time the battlecruiser was regarded as obsolete by the Royal Navy, as she was coal-powered and her 12-inch guns were inferior to the 15-inch guns deployed on the latest generation of capital ships. New Zealand was briefly recommissioned on the 1st of July 1921 with a reserve crew to replace the HMS Hercules as flagship at Rosyth under the command of Captain Ralph Elliott, who was previously been in command of the Hercules. Elliott was to be the ship's last captain and remained in command until the 1st of September 1921. Along with all of the other British 12-inch battleships and battlecruisers, it was agreed that New Zealand would be scrapped to meet the tonnage restrictions set on the British Empire by the Washington Naval Treaty. New Zealand was sold for scrap together with Agincourt and Princess Royal to the Exeter-based electrical engineering firm of J&W Purvis, with the preface that they would be demolished within 18 months of the Washington Naval Treaty being ratified. To meet the Admiralty's desire to provide work for unemployed dock workers at Rosyth Dockyard, the contract was immensely transferred to the contract to a new entity chaired by A. Wallace Golan, called the Rosyth Shipbreaking Company, which would undertake the scrapping of the vessel at Rosyth. It took until the 19th of December 1922 to legally organize the transfer of the ships from the Royal Navy to the new company, which had among its directions Admiral J.E.F. Green, who had commanded the ship at the Battle of Jutland. Lisa's facilities were set up to adjacent to where the vessels were laying alongside a wharf on the south side of the main basin and the naval dockyard at Rosyth. The vessels were taken over on the 25th of January 1923, with work commencing first on New Zealand. By March of 1923, her superstructure had been removed, and she was moved out of the basin and beached above the low tide mark on a beach outside the wall of the Northwest Dockyard. A large portion of the New Zealand's hull was still being dismantled in July of 1924, and it wasn't until September 1924 that the last components of New Zealand were removed from the site, and her place on the beach was taken over by the Princess Royal. Before them, the three vessels yielded 40,000 tons of steel, approximately 10,000 tons of armor plate, and even 3,000 tons of coal still in their bunkers. The New Zealand government received 20,000 euros from the sale of the vessel. The New Zealand government completely paid off the loan used to fund the ship in the 1944/1945 financial year. And this does bring this video to a close. I hope you guys did enjoy it. I hope you guys have stayed this long. I do apologize for the length. This video was actually supposed to be almost 2 hours long, considering the amount of history that is behind the HMS New Zealand. But I did my best to shave off as much of it as I could. I know I left out a lot of information in this video, especially considering her post-World War I career, as well as her 1913 navigation of the globe. Most of it was basically facts that you can look up on your own, and I did not think that they were needed to exactly make her history known as well as I tried to have made it here. Though this, again, was supposed to be a longer one, I hope you guys did enjoy it. and I hope that you learned something about the New Zealand. If you guys did, please go down, hit the like button, leave a comment down below about what you learned, or if there's anything that you can add to this video beyond what I have, or if you guys want to add some bits or pieces that I might have missed. With that being said, please hit the subscribe button, leave a like down below, leave a comment, ring the notification bell, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace out.